In addition,
There we go.
I'm going to do that again. I'm Darren O'Connor with the NAACP Criminal Justice Committee. I'm the chair of that committee and part of the executive committee. We have, as I can see on the Zoom, many of our executive committee members and a bunch of our criminal justice committee is here tonight and members from the church. And I'll be introducing in just a moment our two candidates for Boulder County Sheriff. I want to take a moment to share a little bit about the ground rules, what we're going to do tonight. I'll be asking questions, they're prepared, and then we'll look for questions coming from the audience. Towards the end, we're going to try to end. We're starting a little late, and the crowd here is small, so I'm going to go for us ending at 7:10, since we're starting at about 6:10, and we'll leave enough time to get to some of your questions. I hope I can get to them all, but we'll see how that goes. So we'll be giving the candidates each 2 minutes to answer their questions. And so we have Dave Hayes, who is currently the Louisville Police Chief, who is running sheriff. And we have
Nick, I can't hear.
Johnson. Curtis is they're actually both former Boulder Police Department officers, but Curtis Johnson left most recently. What's your title now? He's Division Chief at the Boulder County Sheriff currently. And I didn't prepare anything else about you fellas, because we're going to take 3 to 5 minutes each and let them introduce themselves. And Curtis, would you like to go first?
It's going through the webcam right now.
Sure. Great. Hopefully everyone can hear me. My name is Curtis Johnson. I'm a candidate for sheriff. As you're probably aware, we're both Democrats running for sheriff. Our election is up on June 28th at the primary. There are no other candidates. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I was born and raised here in Boulder. I'm a product of the Boulder Valley school system. And after leaving the community for a little while, with a college degree in Tacoma, Washington, I also went to Washington, D.C. and spent a couple of years there, got a master's degree while I was out there and worked in D.C. I came back to Boulder in 1993 and began my career with the Boulder Police Department. Started as a patrol officer, as all new employees do, and progressed my career through the organization, having spent time as a detective, a first line supervisor. I worked in professional standards or internal affairs and really learned how the community perceives the police department. You're the kind of customer service agent and the accountability piece for the police department when you serve in that role. I served as a commander in a number of different roles, day shift, night shift, other specialty parts of the organization. And in 2014, I became a deputy chief of police. The first 3.5 years as a deputy chief, I spent on the operations side of the organization, running the operations of the police department, supervising about 200 people. And the second 3 years or so that I was a deputy chief, I spent on the support services side of the organization, where you deal with budget, records, dispatch, and all of the functions that support the police department working. In 2021, I left the Boulder Police Department because Joe Pelly recruited me to come work for him at the sheriff's office. And it was an opportunity for me to learn the sheriff's office from the inside, also bring my perspective as an outsider to the organization, start taking notes, and ultimately run for office to become your next sheriff. Sheriff Pelly has served for 20 years. He's term limited and retiring, and he's looking to set the organization up to continue to succeed as our county sheriff's office. And I've had the opportunity to figure out it's very different than a municipal police department because we're responsible for the Boulder County Jail, which as of today houses about 406 people, and about 50 of them have COVID right now, which is an additional challenge. So learning that side of the organization, a much larger budget, a county-wide responsibility, a response for emergency management and fire, which is different than a lot of municipal police departments face. And so you might ask, why am I running for sheriff? I'm born and raised in Boulder. This is my community. I have lived in Boulder County my entire adult life and worked here. I am passionate about keeping this community safe, and I want to continue the great traditions of the Boulder County Sheriff's Office, but also improve the organization. There are areas that I've seen that we can get better. Some things that are very important to me as I look at becoming sheriff, certainly the intersection of mental health and behavioral health and the criminal justice system. It's a challenge in our jail setting. Jail is not always the right place for people who are suffering from mental illness to get better. And what can we do to do better in that arena? Also, how we respond to people in crisis on the street, and how can we look to reduce police officers from that role and engage other professionals who maybe can do a better job than a law enforcement officer in those situations. I also am focused on recruiting and retaining a diverse workforce at the sheriff's office. I want the sheriff's office to be reflective of the county that we serve. That's a huge challenge when a number of our employees can't afford to live in Boulder County and are commuting to Boulder County for work. So attracting good people to the organization and keeping them, but also having them be mindful of our community, even though they may not live here, is another challenge that I want to take on. I'm also interested in how we can continue to reform the criminal justice system and do better at public safety, even if that involves not always involving law enforcement in what are traditionally public safety tasks or what have been previously public safety tasks, on how we can minimize the police touch on some things that don't really involve a violation of crime or need a full law enforcement response. Can we build out systems that can do that work other than relying on the police to do it? On a personal note, because I see I'm getting close on time, next week I'll celebrate my 29th anniversary. I've been married to my wife since 1993. We have 2 adult children. Both of them are educators in the St. Great Valley School District and live in Longmont. And so gun safety is always on my mind because I shouldn't have to worry about my kids going to work every day in a school. I'll turn it over to Dave. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm Dave Hayes. I'm currently the police chief in Louisville. And I've lived in Louisville or in Boulder County for about the last 45 years. I started with the Louisville Police Department in 1977, just out of high school a few years. Was a police officer in Louisville for about a year, then went to the Boulder Police Department, stayed about 36 years, and left 8 years ago as the police chief in Louisville. I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of what got me to law enforcement. I grew up in Denver. I have 6 brothers and sisters. I'm a middle child. Grew up in a Catholic family, and certainly one of the things on our mind was, priests and going to the priest if you were a male, and of course convent if you were one of my sisters. And I really did give some thought to that until at some point I ran into a Denver police officer working radar on South University. Spent some time talking to him, and I remember thinking, wow, you get paid to help people. Interestingly enough, that Denver police officer and I are still connected 50 years later. He's now since retired from the Denver Police Department, but I think that's really my first introduction to law enforcement. I have 2 children, both raised in Louisville. They went to St. Louis School and Catholic School in Louisville, then to Louisville Middle School, to Monarch, and then I had 1 daughter at CSU and 1 at CU. So they're now both adults living in the metro area, so I get to see them quite a bit. I'm also a member of the NAACP. Was a member with the NAACP before I decided to run. I also serve on the Criminal Justice Committee and the subcommittee for mental health co-responders. Our committee's been working long and hard on this. I certainly understand and agree that we need to have somebody other than law enforcement responding to most mental health calls. We need to make sure, of course, that the situation is safe, and then we let our mental health co-responders figure things out. It's just an easier approach, and what we've learned is, both in my experience in Boulder and in Louisville, is folks that are in crisis really don't necessarily want to see somebody in uniform. They're okay with the firefighter, they're okay with the clinician, but sometimes the police officer is not the right person to be there. I would also be remiss if I didn't mention a couple of comments that I absolutely believe in from Chief Charles Ramsey. He's now the retired police chief in Philadelphia. Before that, he was in Washington, D.C. He says 2 great things. One of them is the absence of crime also requires the presence of justice. And he likes to tell the story about, we know in New York, they went through the stop and frisk kind of situations trying to get guns off the street, which was admirable. But the point that he makes is, so you contact 100 people, typically young men of color, and you get 3 guns off the street. What do you do to repair the damage to the other 97 that you contacted that weren't carrying a gun? So I will always remember that we need to keep that in mind. Also, we need to practice constitutional policing. What I mean by that is, regardless of whether you're a victim or a suspect or an arrestee, our job is to make sure that we protect the constitutional rights of everyone. In Louisville, we do 3 things, at least 3 things really well. We make things better than we found them. We investigate beyond the obvious. And then last but not least, in terms of race, ethnicity, sex, sexual preference, age, immigration status, none of that matters to us. And what I mean by that is we provide policing, good policing, period. None of that is a factor. We are going to provide good policing. Like Kurt, I also spent some time in the Boulder Police Department, spent time in internal affairs, spent time trying to figure out how we could do things better, where we could improve our training in terms of misconduct that may have come up. Also was involved in hiring, besides internal affairs. I absolutely also believe in a diverse work group, but it can't be Boulder's diverse work group. We're not very diverse in Boulder, so we really need to look at a little bit broader, perhaps as far out as Denver. That's where we are recruiting from. That's where we're hiring from. So it would be great to have some homegrown folks like Kurt and myself to some degree. But the fact of the matter is we're not getting as many applicants. So we also need to address that in our schools and in our junior colleges, trying to bring people into the profession. Next month, we're meeting with the Attorney General, the Colorado Chiefs Association, to talk about the shortage of police officers and the shortage of mental health professionals. And we're going to talk to the Attorney General about maybe a job corps or a work corps program, trying to get folks interested. It's great that we want to talk about mental health. We need mental health. We need to make sure that folks in our jail get mental health as well as 24/7 care and get transitioned back out into the community. But we have to have the clinicians. Am I out of time? Just about. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. More to follow.
If you guys want to take positions, I'm told that these microphones should pick you up from where they're at. We'll kind of monitor that and adjust as needed. But if they're too close, if the microphone is too close, it'll feedback, is what I'm told. So
You want for treatment, you want to try speaking?
yeah, let's dial in the sounds.
Check.
Test.
I don't hear anything over the speakers.
They can hear online now.
All right, we'll give it a try, and if we have to go over the question again, this first one, we'll do that. All right, so again, 2 minutes apiece, and I'm going to alternate who goes first. Dave's going to get the first question. So Dave, the NAACP has generally had an open door policy with our current sheriff, despite sometimes strong differences of opinion. And this has been a welcome difference from our relationship with the City of Boulder's Police Department. The question is, do you value having an open door policy with our NAACP branch? Why, and will you continue that policy as sheriff?
Yes, first, the short answer is absolutely, I would continue that policy. Sorry, too close. As I mentioned, I've been a member of NAACP before I decided to run for sheriff. It is a good organization. I've heard the conversations, particularly in the Criminal Justice Committee and some general meetings. We're on the right track. Again, we're all trying to do the right thing, trying to protect the constitutional rights of everyone. In terms of an open door policy, absolutely. One of the things that I'm going to have to do and do now as the police chief is you have to be willing to listen. You have to be willing to listen, and you have to be willing to listen. Far too long, law enforcement has said, we know what the public wants. We know what to do. That just isn't working anymore. Part of being transparent is we need to hear from the community, all aspects of our community, about what they want, how they see policing, how they want the criminal justice system to run. The fact of the matter is, the short answer is that Department of Corrections, the inn is full. There's 15,000 inmates in the Department of Corrections, and there are about 1,000 jail guards short. So we know our prison system is failing. What that also means in terms of with other organizations and trying to listen is we need to figure out a way to stop crime. That means we have to be more preventative, trying to prevent people from being victims, and also trying to reduce the lure, if you will. That means more opportunities. So NAACP is a great organization, and they are trying to do the right thing, and I'm absolutely going to listen and continue.
Thank you. Kurt? I'll read the question again. Do you value having an open door policy with our branch? Why, and will you continue that policy?
So absolutely. And in the last year of working at the sheriff's office, I've come to discover how open that door really is, not only to the NAACP, but to all kinds of other groups in our community that have concerns, that want to provide input, that want to meet with the sheriff. I think as an elected official, your role is very different than an appointed police chief. You are accountable to the community and the voters, and you need to have that open door. Those are lessons we learned from people like our district attorney, who meets with everyone. I show the same value, that it is important to build good relationships. Sometimes the conversations may be difficult. We don't always do everything perfect. And I also value that the NAACP has the courage and the willingness to call us out on those things and talk about it. And sometimes that drives policy change that's meaningful and good for the organization, good for policing, and good for the NAACP. So I not only would maintain that relationship, but value it. I would ask in return that I would have the same relationship with the NAACP, so that if I have questions or concerns, your door is open to me as well. So we can continue that communication and have a two-way dialogue, not just my door being open, but our doors being open. I think it would be more valuable even as a partnership as opposed to just a open door policy. So short answer, yes, absolutely. Why I think I've given you, and yes, it will continue.
Thank you both very much. Kurt, this next one will be for you first. So many parents are rightfully concerned about the safety of their children while in school, and until recently, school resource officers in Boulder were a partial answer to address that concern. However, Black parents and others have legitimate concerns that their children are subject to harsher treatment by law enforcement. This led to the recent removal of SROs in Boulder schools. The question is, what is your position on SROs in schools in Boulder? And what would you do as sheriff to address school safety given the current policy?
So I was employed at the Boulder Police Department when these discussions started. And for a long time, there was a relationship between the Boulder Valley School District and the Boulder Police Department. And we had 5 SROs that worked in schools in Boulder, in the city of Boulder. At the sheriff's office, we have 2 different school districts that we work with, St. Vrain and Boulder Valley, and each is now different. St. Vrain maintains a school resource program, so we do have deputies that work in the St. Vrain Valley schools that are in unincorporated parts of Boulder County, or in Lyons, where we're the contract police agency. With regards specifically to my position on SROs and Boulder Valley schools, I believe that's a decision that's best left to school administrators, school teachers, school boards, and parents. What they determine is best for their schools and their kids is what I believe is best for the schools. If schools decide they want school resource officers in their schools, we are more than willing to support that. But if they decide they don't want school resource officers in their schools, that's okay too. Given the current policy, we still have a very strong relationship with school security staff. We still train to be able to respond to schools when appropriate and necessary, but we don't have deputies within the schools all day like we used to. And I'm comfortable with that. I think that's a decision that is community-based, not sheriff-based, not police chief-based.
Thank you. Dave, and just to remind you the question, what is your position on SROs in schools, and what would you do as sheriff to address school safety given the current policy?
Sure. So in the Louisville Police Department, we did have school resource officers until the school district decided that they didn't want them no longer in the schools. We continue to liaison with schools. We've got a great relationship with our schools, with our high school, and probably are not there quite as much as we once were, but we are there still quite a bit. I'm really a proponent of school resource officers in the schools, but also I'm a proponent when those issues came to us. I represented the Boulder County Chiefs. The Broomfield Police Department represented Broomfield County, who also has Boulder Valley school districts in their city or in the city and county. And we offered and continue to have an offer open to members of the school board, the school administration. If there were things that need to be done differently, and I would agree that they are based on some of those numbers, then let's sit down and talk about it. But what we weren't given is really much of a chance to talk about it. But at the same time, I'm also concerned, like everyone is we need to make sure that the policing that we provide is fair, equal, and but that can be accomplished, and I think that's accomplished through conversations. I am concerned about school safety. We've got our kids in those schools down in the great state of Texas. We lost a whole generation of kids down there. I don't know what difference in that particular community, how much of a difference a school resource officer would have made, but I can tell you we've got some older school resource officers and more senior school resource officers or former officers in Louisville that are now talking to kids that are now adults. And they did have a good relationship with them, and I would like to think that it made a difference. So I'm hopeful, again, it's completely up to the school board, but I'm hopeful that we can have some more conversations with the school board and maybe figure out a model that works for everybody and provides safety.
Thank you. Next one's for you first, Dick. Our current sheriff recently requested that the county commissioners pass an ordinance that would make it illegal to carry out acts of daily living and using shelter such as a tent, as well as making it illegal to sleep in one's vehicle except for 1 day a week. County commissioners ultimately voted against the ordinance that was proposed, but the underlying concerns about trash and sewage may still be an issue. So will you seek an amended ordinance, and if so, what changes from the original ordinance will you include that addresses the needs of our unhoused neighbors?
Absolutely. I like my opponent, we've got an interesting perspective. For some period of time now, we've been homeless. So that does absolutely give you a different perspective. We both lost our homes in the Marshall Fire. And while we've landed someplace, unlike a lot of people, it still is something that you've got to think about. I don't agree with an ordinance like that. I don't think it should be a crime to be homeless. What's missing from that is not I don't think enforcement is part of the piece. I think there's some education piece. There's certainly some health pieces with that, making sure that we've got services and we've got for health and safety kind of reasons, but I don't think we should make it a crime. I also think that as sheriff, I think it's worth revisiting, not necessarily the criminal aspect of it, but I think we need to get the right people in the room and have a conversation. What's your perspective? What can we count on you for? Otherwise, we just continue to play this, we used to play as kids, the whack-a-mole game, right? We fix it here, but then we've got issues in the criminal justice system. We've got the constitutionality questions about whether or not it's even legal or not. I don't think we go there. I think we figure out the health and safety parts of this and figure out a longer term basis, what steps we can take moving towards that end. Times are tough. We think we have homeless population now. As the economy continues to decline, we're going to have more homeless population. We need to have that conversation sooner than later. And it's not an enforcement, not a write a ticket for sleeping in your car. That's not the answer.
Thank you. And Kurt, the question is, will you seek an amended ordinance? And if so, what change from the original ordinance will you include that addresses the needs of our unhoused neighbors?
So full disclosure, Darren and I have had a lot of conversations over the years about the unhoused community in Boulder. And having worked in Boulder and experienced that and the waves of different political ideologies and challenges with how we deal with homelessness in Boulder has been a long journey. I feel like right now we're at a place where we've almost reached the breaking point. And I feel like as a leader in Boulder County, it's time to take some risks and try some things that other communities have been unwilling to do. And by that, I mean, this proposed ordinance was really initially in response to the fact that most of the municipalities in Boulder County have outlawed camping, living in a car, all those activities. And unhoused people are smart enough to figure out that if they go into unincorporated Boulder County, there's not a law against it and they can live there. That drew complaints. And the quick reaction was, let's make a law. I think it's the right time. I would not revisit the ordinance as it was proposed. I don't know exactly the smartest way to amend it, but I think we should have some really good conversations about it. I think the thing that has frustrated me over the years is the lack of coordination across the county and the lack of willingness. You know, one community will pass a law that pushes people into another place. Also the lack of willing to take some risk and do some things that other communities are doing that might work. And you have to be willing to fail. Sometimes things don't work as you exactly want them to, but we haven't tried a sanctioned campground anywhere in Boulder County. We have very limited state parking lots. Longmont's trying, but there's a wait list and there's not enough help. The challenge is always getting people together because unfortunately, a lot of times the police end up trying to manage these things. And I'm not a proponent of that either, because I don't think we should have police officers patrolling a sanctioned campground. So we have to find other solutions, other groups, other people that are willing to help. There should be some government support for that. Exactly how that looks really will have to involve the commissioners, city councils across the entire county, and coordinating an effort to try to do right by our unhoused community and make sure that we can keep them safe and alive, especially in the winter. Thanks.
Thank you. Kurt, this one's for you first. Our community has taken to the streets after, sadly, far too many deaths of Black people at the hands of law enforcement. In response to the killing of Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, Sandy Bland, George Floyd, and too many others to name, the Black Lives Matter movement was spawned. What is your understanding of the phrase Black Lives Matter?
So my understanding of the phrase Black Lives Matter really comes down to until law enforcement acknowledges the harms it has caused the Black community, and until we're willing to recognize that Black lives matter, nobody's lives matter, nobody's safe.
Thank you. And Dave, for you, what is your understanding of the phrase Black Lives Matter?
I think almost exactly the same. I think certainly all lives matter, but in particular, Black lives matter just because of the number of incidents that we've read about across this country, some even as close as Aurora, Colorado, not too far down the road. We didn't handle those situations well. So as law enforcement, we need to be willing to sit down, talk about those things and address it and meaningfully address those things about what's going to be different. How are my kids going to be safe? If I was a person of color, how are my kids going to be safe in the community? We need to have those conversations. We need to have some commitment from law enforcement leaders, me as the sheriff and our police chiefs, to make sure that those kind of things are not going to happen here, and that we are going to hire and train people to make sure that address any biases they may have good discussions about it, and we just need to do better, and that's my understanding, because we have made mistakes as law enforcement officers.
All right. I'm gonna do a little follow-up on that, because this is the NAACP, and this is a key issue for our branches across the country and the national organization. And the concern is that when someone says all lives matter, I think there's a understandable response from the Black community that white lives have always mattered in this country. And so I think when people hear all lives matter, it feels a bit like a discount. And another thing that is often said about the phrase is that there's a silent two with two O's. You know, that it's Black Lives Matter also, because we already know that white lives have mattered in the state. So maybe you could just address for a moment how that lands for you, each of you, and we'll start with you, Dave, and what you would say to someone who, if they were here saying, but of course all lives matter, but in the past it's been white lives that get the preponderance of the protection.
I think that's exactly what I would say. I think we are fortunate in this part of the country, in this part of the state, in this part of the county, or in Boulder County, that we do practice good constitutional policing. Our law enforcement officers do and have made mistakes, We'll make mistakes going forward. And yeah, it is different. It is not exactly the same because it wasn't fair to begin with. And so Black lives do matter, and they matter more importantly now because of the number of incidents. We should have seen this coming a long time ago. We didn't see it. Unfortunately, we had a lot of loss of life. And so it is different and it is significant. And we have to recognize that. It is not the same. My life is not the same.
Thank you. Curtis?
Yeah, so as I said earlier, I'm a white man who grew up in white Boulder, and I understand and know the privilege that came with in my upbringing. And I think to address kind of the heart of your question, I watched the film This Is Not Who We Are, and it resonated me, and it was hard to watch because I was a police officer in Boulder during the entirety of those incidents. And the undercurrent of racism in Boulder that rose to the surface after those incidents and became clear and loud continues to resonate with me as someone who has privilege as a white human being, but also as someone who is a law enforcement officer and introduces an entirely different power dynamic to any room I'm in. And working through the police oversight process and working with people who were concerned about how we policed in Boulder taught me a lot about why we need to value Black life in our community and why we need to stand up for that and make sure that Blacks in our community are not mistreated like they have been in other communities the best that we can, and recognize who we are as individuals in this community and how our community members of color are treated on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you both. Dave, this one's to you first. No introduction here, just a question. What do you think the relationship is between incarceration and reducing crime?
I think they're absolutely tied together. If we reduce crime, then we reduce people being the victims of crime, and we also reduce the opportunity to commit crime. So they're absolutely related. If we can fix the front end or reduce the front end, reduce the front end, then we can also reduce the back end because we know our prison systems are failing. So one of the things that we are going to do in Boulder County, I'm going to do as the sheriff is we're going to make sure that we provide 24/7 care and we help people transition back into the community. And that means education, that means training, that means whatever, temporary housing. We need to get people back into the community and make sure that they, to the extent we can, that they don't fail and return back again. Certainly at the state level, they're about 50% of which would be failing rate. And we're going to do it better in Boulder County.
Okay, and as a little follow-up is, do you think incarceration is necessary to reduce crime?
That's a great question. And I think the answer is, it depends on, it's a safety question. It's a safety for a potential victim. It's a safety question for the community at large. And then if we've got somebody that maybe has a history of failure to appear, those are criteria we should look at. I'm not talking about serious homicide charges. I'm talking about something less than that, but create some safety hazard in the community. Those are the folks that should be incarcerated. We also know that with that, using that criteria, that we do have people that have failed to appear, continue to have people that have failed to appear in Boulder that can't now be jailed. Unfortunately, what that means is, number one, they can't get in, they can't get services, they can't get court-ordered kind of treatment. And when you don't have a defendant because the defendant can't go to jail and it's not required to appear, you also don't have a victim. That means that the victim, because the system doesn't move forward, there's no restitution, there's no ability to address the court.
Thanks. So Kirk, the question is, what do you think the relationship is between incarceration and reducing crime? And then the follow-up was, do you think incarceration is an important, I didn't ask you exactly the same, but is incarceration really important as a piece of reducing crime?
So there are certain crimes that people are going to end up in jail for, but there are a lot of crimes in our community that I think we should be looking at other programs and other opportunities to keep people out of jail or provide alternative sentencing facilities to allow them to maintain connections in the community to really reduce crime in the long run. And what I mean by that is we have robust programming and opportunities to use restorative justice for some crimes. We have opportunities to use diversion programs where people basically complete a diversion sentence. And if they don't reoffend, they're not hampered by a record of having a criminal conviction that will prevent them from getting a job or getting housing or getting other things that will keep them from committing crimes later, potentially, because they're housed and they can be employed. Probably the biggest program that I'm excited about is the alternative sentencing facility that will be breaking ground on later this year. Several years ago, there was a tax ask to increase the size of the jail. Our community said, no, thank you. In lieu of that, a couple of years later, the idea of an alternative sentencing facility was proposed, and our community said, absolutely, that's a better solution. We're looking forward to building that because it will create 252 beds for lower level offenders who can serve community correction sentences or work release sentences in a facility that's not a jail. It will allow them the opportunity to get mental health care, allow them to get substance abuse care, allow them to get job training, job programming, and the ability for those that are on work release to maintain employment and be able to transition out of incarceration into a more stable setting with follow-up, with additional services so that they land on their feet and aren't put in a position where their only alternative is to commit crime to survive. So that's kind of my view on it. I'm not convinced that for all offenders, jail is the right answer to reduce crime. There's a prevention component, what we can do to stop crime before it happens. There are certain people that may need to be held accountable in a jail setting, but there's a large swath of people that may have an opportunity to succeed through the criminal justice system, land on their feet, and not commit crimes again in the future. And that's the best crime prevention we can do.
Thanks. As a follow-up to that, during the pandemic, we had the jail set limits on how many people could be in, and we were not jailing people, to my understanding, for low-level municipal offenses. Can you both comment on what you know and what you think were the effects of that?
So some of that, it's too soon to tell.
Maybe 2 minutes.
It's too soon to tell because we're still in a bit of pandemic. Through the pandemic, we were running at about 300 people in jail. The capacity is about 540. That was really done to meet CDC guidelines on spacing and making sure that we were keeping people in the jail safe. And most importantly, nobody died in the jail from COVID. That was important to us. Currently, we're at about 406 people in the jail. We relaxed some of those standards earlier this year, only to have another wave of the pandemic strike. And we're really struggling to manage the population in the jail. I think what will be interesting moving forward is looking at the data on who was incarcerated, how that went, who was allowed into the jail, what happened to crime in our communities, if anything, how that translates, and being able to look back on this as an experience to say, did it work?
Thank you. So crime in our communities absolutely went up, whether it's all attributable to COVID or the lack of jail space or the lack of willingness to let people into the jail. Crime went up. Colorado is now #1 in auto theft, #1 in bank robberies. So crime has absolutely gone up, and it's gone up in Boulder County. The effect on a municipality like the city of Louisville, the municipal stuff is kind of the least of our worries. Although the jail today still will not take any municipal prisoners or any municipal sentencing. We didn't have a lot in Louisville, but what that means is that if you're the kind of person that gets a ticket in Louisville, you'll worry about it until you take care of it. But if you're the kind of person that gets a ticket in Louisville and don't want to take care of it, guess what happens to you? Nothing. There's no ramifications to that. We still have folks in our hotels, as we do in other parts of the county, that are wanted on felony warrants that the jail won't take. That has to have some impact on our crime. And more importantly, perhaps even better than that, is that we've got these folks who can't be arrested, can't move forward because the jail won't take them. I've offered and suggested to our current sheriff, to Sheriff Kelly, that we bring folks in.
Time's up, but go ahead and finish.
Yeah, and allow them to come in and have some additional restrictions from the judge, get them ordered into treatment, those kind of things. And so far that hasn't happened, and our crime is going up.
Yeah. Curtis, this one's for you first. Our current sheriff is known for working with the legislature to address issues such as the intersection of incarceration and mental health. Question for you is, will you continue this sort of legislative advocacy? And if so, what areas of improvement do you think are ripe for such law enforcement advocacy?
So the quick answer is yes, absolutely. And that was made clear to me when I decided to run for sheriff, that we have a very unique opportunity in Boulder County because we have a Democrat as a sheriff, which a lot of counties in the state of Colorado do not. We have a democratically controlled state house, and a lot of the leadership in the state house is Boulder focused, Boulder centric. Steve Finberg, president of the Senate, is a Boulder state senator. So there's an obligation on my part to make sure that we play a role in that. And some of it is really in the best interest of the criminal justice system, because oftentimes legislators craft laws without having real world knowledge of how those laws may impact the community or the criminal justice system. And we need to advocate for making good law that we don't have to go back and change over and over again. So we get it right the first time. So being an active player in that arena is something I'm absolutely committed to. If you look at who's endorsed me, Steve Finberg, Judy Mabele, Edie Hooten, Karen McCormick, that's because I've met and built relationships with those people already, because I anticipate working with them next year in the legislative session, once they get reelected this fall, the reps. As far as areas where we can improve, there are always opportunities. Every year, there is some public safety focus on laws. There are some things I would like to continue to tweak that are already law. One that I've spoken about or mentioned previously is SB 2217, which was the police accountability law. There's a part of that that deals with gathering demographic data on police stops. And one of the challenges with that is how we define what constitutes a stop. How long do you want me to go?
We got 30 seconds.
Okay. And for me, what's important is making sure that we're collecting data on self-initiated police officer activity, the stops that they choose to make, because that's where we can work to identify bias. And if we cloud those numbers with witnesses, victims, other people that they come into contact with, we may not get the whole picture of exactly how they're policing when they have free time to go out and do their work. So there are always opportunities to tweak and change laws. And I look forward to working with the legislature next year to continue that advocacy on behalf of the Sheriff's Office.
Thank you. And Dave, the question again is, will you continue this sort of legislative advocacy that Sheriff Paley engaged in? And if so, what areas of improvement do you think are ripe for such law enforcement advocacy?
It's a great question. So yes, I would continue that effort, but would not only be Sheriff Pelly's efforts, but also the current effort that I participate in. I'm the president-elect of the Colorado Chiefs Association and have served on our legislative committee for the last couple of years. So the last couple of legislative sessions I've participated in, I've spoke with our elected representatives, I've testified and tried to offer input and suggestions as we could and learn more about the legislative process. It is a great process. It's supposed to be, those are our elected officials, so we can give them the information, but ultimately we have to follow the law, and we are going to do that. So yes, continuing on with that. In one case, an example would be the most recent fentanyl bill. We know that fentanyl is killing our children, certainly young adults. I'm happy to see that it passed. Chiefs Association, for the most part, was in support of that because it offers prevention, education, enforcement, and treatment. And then getting back to the police contact, I would disagree with my opponent on that one. Is we're making those contact sheets now, but what we were able to do in Louisville is we want to know who we're providing police services to. The law requires now that we do suspects and arrestees, but we have that data now. We have that from police reports. What's more important is who are we providing police services to? So in the city of Louisville, our officers fill out a contact sheet on just about everybody they come into contact with. They're fast, they're quick. We can separate out the data. The state only wants suspects and arrestees, but I want to look at the rest of the data to make sure that we're providing services throughout our community. So that, again, that was a bill that we went above and beyond what the state required.
Okay, thank you. So that's the end of my written questions. We have a few others, and I have some on the top of my head, but let's go. First, does anyone in the audience have questions to share? Anyone else? Got them? All right. So someone did their homework and provided their question in the past week or two, so I'm gonna ask their question first. And that is, and let's see, so we went Curtis last time, so this will be for you, David. How did you participate leading up to 2021 in the process around state legislation, SB 2162, the jail population management tool.
I don't know that I had direct participation in that. The Chiefs Association worked with the county sheriffs of Colorado and the Fraternal Order of Police, again, with safety in mind, but also making sure that only the right people were going to jail, the people that because there was a risk to the community. So that was our participation, and that was my involvement. Again, ensuring that, or making sure that our legislatures were aware of all the pieces, and they were, but it was something that we wanted to also talk about.
And I would tell you, during the legislative session in 2021 was when I was transitioning out of the Boulder Police Department. So I played no role in that part of my career and didn't start my job until later in March of 2021. At that point, I did have an opportunity to speak with the sheriff about that bill because I think it was a challenge to try to find the balance between where to draw the line about who goes into the jail and who doesn't. So my participation was very ancillary at that point, still learning the ropes of working at the sheriff's office.
Gotcha. This one comes from our Zoom attendees. So this will go to you first, Curtis. What process would you put in place to mitigate bias in policing?
That might take more than 2 minutes to answer because I think that is ongoing work that has to be committed to by an organization, committed to by leadership, committed to in every aspect of how we run the sheriff's office. And so I think for me, it starts with employees in the academy setting. I think there are areas that we can improve the academy setting. One of the areas that has been talked about but has never been implemented is some history about policing in America and all of the negative impacts that policing has imparted upon communities of color throughout time and history, so that people getting into the profession understand why people may not be comfortable with them, even if they're just dealing with the victim of a crime. I think then it takes some robust work at the sheriff's office with ongoing training of making sure we can develop employees to be at least culturally competent in the community that they work in and recognize the community that they're serving and treat people appropriately. It is a great challenge to ask someone to harness all of their biases and go to work, but it's what we have to do. We have to figure out ways to manage how we feel inside, how we were raised, and even broader, the systems that we work in that have been, since creation, pushed towards the advantage of whites in our community because they were developed by whites and they've always favored whites, and they have marginalized people of color throughout time and history. Getting back to your question, it would be very long, arduous, ongoing work. The county is already committed to work in racial equity, how we manage bias, how we figure out how to do our jobs without imparting that onto people. But that is going to be an ongoing process that even for me, I know it's a process you have to commit to that takes time. You can't automatically overnight be bias free and figure out tomorrow I'm going to be great. We have to learn every day. We have to take advantage of opportunities to see even negative incidents and call them out and make sure that our employees understand what happened and how to move forward.
Thanks. And for you, Dave, what processes would you put in place to mitigate bias in policing?
Great question. I've been the police chief in Louisville for 8 years. I've hired everybody that's come in the door in Louisville. So when we hire people, we certainly look at all their test results. I have at least one conversation with everybody, trying to listen, have them talk about themselves, have them talk about their families, and just listen very carefully. And some of that may not always come out in the testing, so that's why we use some outside sources like a police psychologist, and we're still using polygraphs. So for me, it really starts at the hiring process, and we have not, fortunately, not had to deal with that. But at any point during that process, or any point during somebody's career, if they have a bias that we can't correct or that person can't recognize, and I'm not talking about a serious bias, but a bias that causes some concern to us, we are not going to keep them. We all have implicit biases. the point is that the important part of that is we have to do some self-reflection, recognize that, and talk about it with our coworkers and take that next step. We do training in the city of Louisville, both offered by the city, also our police officer standards and training that we have to do on an annual basis. And we have these conversations about bias. I'm also happy to report that in Louisville, the organization I currently run, that if we had somebody practicing bias-based policing, we would know about it, or their fellow coworkers would know about it long before us, and they would certainly let us know about that. One of the things that I brought to Louisville was a value-based management system. So everything we do, everybody, things, people we hire, our policies, how we show up to work, how we present ourselves is all based on that value-based management system. That's one of the things that I'm going to bring to the sheriff's office is there's a need for a culture change at the sheriff's office that I may not have time in this question to go into. And again, we've got to be willing to have these tough conversations. So when we look for trainers that we've used in Louisville, we look for trainers that have tough conversations with us. So we just don't go through the motions. We actually hire trainers that actually really engage the audience in those conversations. We have to be willing to have those conversations. We just have to, or we're never going to get past.
Thanks. Would you guys like to ask a question? No? All right. All right, our next one, this will go to you first, Dave. What will you do to prevent police violence against Black and brown people?
Well, again, I think it ties back to bias. It ties back to who we hire, how we train them, how we present ourselves, how they're supervised, those kind of things. So I think we just always have to be mindful. That doesn't mean that we have to watch our employees every day, all day long, but we do have to continue to look at the culture. I think there is some needed culture change at the sheriff's office. And so again, it's how we show up, how we train, what our policies are about, and we just have to practice what we preach, and that is that we provide or we protect the constitutional rights of everyone, period. And it doesn't matter how they come to us, whether they're a victim or a suspect or an arrestee, our job and we are obligated to protect their constitutional rights. And I think if we can instill that in our employees and reinforce that with our employees, I think we'll have little issues with that. But we also have to recognize it does occur in policing, and it has occurred in Boulder County, and we need to be mindful of that.
Thanks. Curtis, what will you do to prevent police violence against Black and brown people is the question.
So I think for me, there are several things that I would look to do. One is continuing to preach and work on de-escalation tactics and communication skills. Those are two things that buy time. Also making sure that our employees are patient when they're dealing with people. I think sometimes when you see violent acts, it's a rush to get something done. It doesn't need to be done in a hurry. So making sure that employees are supported and know that they have time to resolve situations without resorting to violence is important. And creating that understanding in our organization that we don't have to hurry. We don't have to rush to get things done. The other piece that I think is important is having a diverse work group. I am absolutely looking forward to recruiting and retaining more women in policing. There's a program out there called 30 by 30 to try to get 30% of police forces up to having 30% of your police force be women by 2030. I think that's very important for us. When I worked at Boulder at one point, we had 25% of our employees were women, and women like working with women. Women police differently. Women bring different skill sets. So having a diverse employee group gives you a diversity of thought when you're dealing with a tense situation, and different people can perceive and communicate with people differently. So if we have a diverse work group that can communicate with, it may take a woman to build a relationship or rapport with someone we're dealing with before we get to violence. It may take someone of color communicating with them. And so having that work group available that provides you opportunities to engage with people and not use violence, but develop rapport and be able to de-escalate a situation is important to me. And getting women into the mix and promoting them through our organization is part of that, because as I mentioned, a woman's mindset in policing is often different than a man's. And I think that's a good, healthy thing to have that diversity of thought when we approach difficult problems.
Thank you. We haven't talked about this topic much, and this will go to you first, Curtis. The questioner asks, I live in unincorporated Boulder County. The emergency notification system is inconsistent. What do you plan to do to improve it?
So there's already a lot of work being done. As Dave mentioned, both of us lost our homes in the Marshall Fire, which adds a different element of urgency for both of us to see this through. The current system was really designed for our mountain communities where landlines exist and where threats previously existed. We know that our entire community is at risk now after the Marshall Fire. So we've already implemented wireless emergency alerts through the iPause network, which means we can communicate with any cell phone in a given area roughly. It comes with some challenges and flaws where we're trying to evacuate smaller, more focused areas. But we also need to really engage the community that is east of the mountains and make sure that they understand preparedness. They understand how we launch alerts, where they can sign up to get the most appropriate information. And it's going to involve a broad community effort through emergency management, law enforcement, fire. We all need to work together to make sure that we are informing our community and notifying them appropriately when danger exists. And that work is already heavily underway because we want to have things in place sooner than later.
Gotcha. Dave, the question was, what do you plan to do to improve the emergency notification system in Boulder County?
As my opponent mentioned, we do have a system. It worked pretty well. We're fortunate that we had just 2 losses or 3 losses of life, I think. 3's too many, 1's too many. And it also occurred during the daylight hours. We did learn that the system does have some limitations to it. There is a plan going to the iPause, which brings its own set of problems because the overreaching, kind of the bleed over, if you will. The good news is we got most people notified. We know that most people take about 3 different notifications for them to realize that it's real. We had a lot of that going on in Louisville. One of the things that specifically that we're working on in the city of Louisville is our polygons, and the polygons is an area that we want to evacuate. One of the things that happened during the Marshall Fire was there was a rush to let's evacuate the whole city. We couldn't evacuate the whole city because it's an age-old problem of too many cars, not enough road. Had we tried to evacuate the whole city, what we would have done is we probably would have burned people in their cars at Biapi and South Boulder Road had that fire had gone that direction instead of the direction it went into. So it's not only the notification plan that I'm going to work on as the sheriff, but we're going to make sure that if you're in this neighborhood, what are your access, what's your ingress, what's your egress, and what instructions can we give you? What we can't do is we can't say run for your life. What we have to say is here's the situation, here's your instructions, here's the neighborhood, and we figured out what the ingress and egress are. So it's a whole lot of work that should have been done before now. We've learned a lot from the Marshall Fire, and certainly as the Louisville Police Chief, I'm committed, and certainly will be committed to do that as the Boulder County Sheriff. There's more work to be done. We're working on that now with our other public safety folks in Boulder County. We just met last week to talk about lessons learned, which was the emergency notification system, the polygons, and what we can do better to help our community stay safe as our weather continues to change.
Thank you. Another audience question. Would you name the top 3 biases, and this is going to go to you first, Steve. Will you name the top 3 biases that keep policing from being equitable for all people? And how do you address these with current officers?
Think about this. I think age, I'll start with that one. That's probably a little bit easier one. I think that what I've seen in my years of policing, that police officers sometimes have less tolerance or less acceptance for people that are younger. And that's something that we can and continue to address. I think we've also got the issue of people of color, of people that are different than us. We don't understand. We just don't understand, don't choose to understand, and the person doesn't fit, right? We're a fairly affluent white community in Boulder County, and the bias would be is that we contact people, we're supposed to contact people that don't fit, right? We're supposed to be investigating things. Well, the whole idea behind that is not that there's a bad person around every corner. The idea is that you're supposed to be on the lookout for things or problems, but I think some officers internalize that to say, let me figure out who doesn't fit. And it's pretty easy to do that in Boulder County when you see a person of color. That would be a second one. I suppose the third one, given my years of experience at the university, that Kurt may agree with too, is a little bit of bias against CU students. Kind of used to be the kind of the running joke with the university was, you know, since they say, I guess the person's obnoxious, so they're probably a CU student, and chances are their dad's a lawyer. So that would be the third one. That's a little bit easier to deal with. That's something that our supervisors dealt with in Boulder on a regular basis. And again, we just have to be mindful of that. And again, we're fortunate in Louisville and I think in most of Boulder County that we would know about those kind of things long before supervisors, the supervisors would hear about it, but our officers, they would hear about it from their fellow officers saying, hey, look, it doesn't seem right. This person is always doing this, or it seemed like he or she was too hard on this person. Sergeant or corporal, or whatever the supervisor might be, I need you to know about this. So those would be the three things that come to mind.
All right, yeah, that was a tough luck of the draw on that first. Thank you. So Curtis, could you name the top 3 biases that keep policing from being equitable for all people, and how do you address these with current officers?
So I think the first is obviously race. Being a very white community, people of color stand out. And I think there are historic and even systematic ideologies that race somehow involves crime. And how do we work on that? I think we talked about that earlier, about how we break down bias and how we continue to work on getting people to work past their biases. I think in our community, housing status is another. Unhoused or policed differently than housed. And that's just another bias in this community. Sometimes it's called to our attention by people and we're expected to deal with it. Other times it is self-initiated activity that maybe that person's got a warrant. Maybe there's something going on there that I should go deal with. So housing status is one. And I think one that resonates for me some because I know books have been written about how we deal with motor vehicles in our community, condition, type, what's out of place in our community. There are certainly cultural ties to certain motor vehicles. There are people who are perhaps financially disadvantaged that have different motor vehicles. And in this community, again, they will stand out. And so if you're not driving a Mercedes or a nice clean Honda, you might be focused on, or I guess in this community, a Prius or a Tesla. Focus turns to things that look out of place, as my opponent said. That's part of what policing looks for, but is that right? And are we targeting the wrong people or making stops based on what they're driving as opposed to who they are or what crime they're committing?
Thank you both for that. We're about out of time and we're going to have 2 minutes for each of you to give a closing and address anything that came up. I did have one question that is very short, and that is, we'll go to you first, Curtis. What news station do you listen to on the radio?
So I'll tell you what I listen to on the radio every morning. So driving to work, I listen to a funny radio show, Bobby Bones, on a country station. But that's only because at 7:03, right after I get my coffee, they do the morning corny, which is a dad joke that I bring to my employees every morning. After that, when I'm in my car, typically I'm listening to NPR, unless I'm listening to music, and then I'm usually listening to KBCO.
Thank you. And to you, Dave.
I mean, depending on what's on, would be the National Public Radio, not that, because I like music. It's cozy 101.1. It's a little bit of everything and enough news so you kind of know what's going on in the world. But also it's really more about the community and what's going on.
I'm gonna have to check out the
Morning
funnies. And my daughter likes Cozy 101.1. She's 16, so I was surprised to hear. Okay, let's see. Curtis started, so I'm gonna let Dave have you start with the closing.
Okay. Well, thank you. What I bring to the table is a proven leader with proven accomplishments. You're welcome to look at my website about the accomplishments that I've done since almost entering policing, a number of victim awards, both from our current district attorney's office and within the police department. I'm the only candidate with executive law enforcement experience. I've been the police chief in Louisville for the last 8 years. I was been a law enforcement manager since 1978. In terms of current accomplishments or notable accomplishments, in Louisville, we brought in our own mental health clinician because we saw that coming. We became accredited the first time in our history. We brought in body cams long before the state mandate, and also brought in Boulder app, which is an alternative to taser. We know we saw a lot of misuse of tasers in the last few years. The Boulder app is a safer way to take somebody into custody that maybe has mental health issues. It's really a rope, if you will, gives the officers a little bit of a head start so we can take a person into custody safer. We've got a great relationship with our hospitals. Both Centennial Peaks is a mental health facility and also Vista. I mentioned we have people in our community that can't get into the jail. And what are we going to do with those folks? So we make sure that we've got a Louisville Superior Food Bank. Anyone, without any question, can go to our food bank and get a week's worth of food without any questions about race, ethnicity, immigration status, those kind of things. We also provide information to the folks we come into contact with about housing, veterans, mental health. I continue to work on some charitable projects and volunteer work with one of our local churches, where we do neighborhood cleanups. Again, those are all people in our community without regard to race, sex, ethnicity, those kind of things. Again, as I mentioned, we're working on the citizen notification. We're working on trying to get some different fire dispatching. And, last but not least, I think Joe's done a good job. I think there's things to follow, but I think we can also do a better job in some aspects.
20 seconds.
Okay. And as I think I mentioned before, I did bring a contemporary value-based management system to the organization that permeates throughout our organization, both our policies, who we hire, those kind of things. And as I mentioned previously, what I would also bring is a culture change to the sheriff's office. There's been a couple of things of concern. A person in restraints in the jail, actually 2 people in restraints in the jail, were tortured with the tasers. And then we also had a young man die in the sheriff's office custody. Those 2 deputies are in the Department of Corrections. It's time for a culture change at the sheriff's office. Joe's done a good job, but there's also a time for a culture change. And I suspect what Kurt may mention is that we need more supervisors in the jail. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that it was a supervisor that did the second taser.
Thanks. Your turn, Chris.
My turn. So first, thank you for having us here tonight. Appreciate the opportunity to tell you a little bit about myself, why I'm running for sheriff, and why I think I'm the best candidate to follow in Sheriff Kelly's footsteps and lead the organization forward. I want to address, I'm surprised that the taser incidents in the jail didn't come up earlier because I came armed with a little bit of data that I want to share with you. In 2019, there were 30 taser uses in the jail. After policy changes and training in 2020, that was cut in half to 15. And last year, that was more than cut in half to just 6. And I say that because part of changing a culture and getting your messages across is holding people accountable. And the employees that were involved in the incidents, especially the incident that occurred after policy change, that employee was terminated. That employee was criminally prosecuted and found guilty at trial. And that's appropriate. And that means there's leadership in the organization holding people accountable, and changes in the numbers to go from 30 to 6 in a matter of 3 years is a remarkable reduction in the use of force. And I think that's a positive thing. I think what you will find in me is someone who wants to build a relationship with groups like the NAACP and other community organizations that have interest in the criminal justice system, how we keep our community safe, and how we balance the needs of everyone in our community to keep everyone safe. There's a reason so many people support me. If you look at my website, it's because they know I'm collaborative. They know that I'm willing to work with them, and they know that I get things done. And I know that the sheriff's office has been led by the same person for 20 years, but even that individual admits that the organization needs a jump start, a little kick in the rear, and that's my opportunity to jump in, hit the ground running in January because I'm already employed, and make additional progress moving forward. I bring different experiences from my time at Boulder PD, different experiences from working with communities of color in Boulder to work on police oversight and learn from them how policing can be better in our community. And I look forward to serving as your next sheriff. I look forward to working with you in the future. Thanks.
Thank you. So that wraps our time up. We're at 7:16, so we did pretty well. We're going to have some time for you gentlemen to speak with folks in the audience here, and maybe you could take turns at the computer if you have time, because there were some questions that came through. I do want to just share, I'll join you guys up here, just share that the NAACP as a 501c4 can't endorse anyone, but we're really grateful to have you both here. hear your perspectives on our questions. There were quite a few coming in hot and heavy at the end, so I know people were getting more and more interested, and I had more myself, but I appreciate your time on a Monday. You guys are busy folks, and wish you both the best of luck in the race, and thank you again for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.